But let me come back for a moment. I have not heard much, if anything, on policies. And I would be very curious to hear from you in the sense that are there effective policies that are great on paper and not being implemented? Is that the problem? Or that we just have too many policies? I think in the previous session there was the issue about Ministry of Follow-up. But if you had a moment to think through what, for a research organization like IFPRI on policies, but with policymakers in the room, what should we be saying on policy front? We talked a lot about the evidence, but what's on the policy front? Any particular thoughts? Anybody wants to come in? Taibon?
Thank you. Short and sweet. Involve the smallholder farmers in developing or revising the policies. A lot of times governments, private sector, they come up with policies that are thinking are good for the producers without involving them, and find that at the end of the day it doesn't work, not as well as they expected, because they were not involved in formulating or reviewing the policies. Thank you.
Short and sweet indeed. Jay?
I think, when we're working on bringing in better technology, seeds, etc., we find that on one side there is a huge need for increasing productivity, and the other side, when we go back to the government to get approvals to bring this technology, it takes 3 or 4 years sometimes, and even to import the first set of seeds. And this, it's a very helpless situation and very frustrating for the private sector companies. That it just takes such a long time, and you're seeing this opportunity. Whatever trials you've done, testing you've done. So I think unifying policy, taking responsibility. I don't think anybody is really. I think there is a nervousness about biodiversity, the genetics, etc. But we need to have a faster system because people are suffering. The smallholder farmers are suffering, and we can transform that very easily.
Thank you. Prabhu, you wanted to come in, and then Karen.
I don't think there's a dearth of policies, but I think there's a serious lack of coherence across policies, and there's serious silos of policies by each ministry. So. The Ag Ministry has a whole set of agriculture policies, and the Nutrition Ministry would have a whole set of nutrition policies, but there's absolutely no connection between the nutrition policies and the ag policies. Now, if you started off by saying, we need to have a set of policies around getting the most successful, agriculture, food and diversity of food, so that women can have safe pregnancies, safe births, and go through the first 1,000 days safely and have children who are then not undernourished and who have high levels of nutrition security into the future, then that's a whole different ballgame than saying, let's have a policy to maximize rice production in this country and maximize wheat production in this country. And then the nutrition group talks about let's have a policy around the first 1,000 days, and there's no connection between the two.
Great point. Karen?
I think every one of the sessions that we've had over the past 2.5 days has had a policy dimension to it. So clearly policies run through it all, but for the purpose of this discussion now, we've also heard quite a lot about capacity and the need for national capacity and local capacity. And I would like to argue that capacity is a policy issue. It's a question of whether or not national governments are investing in their institutions, in their science capacity, and whether they have a pay scale that allows them to retain their scientists once they are trained and in the system. And I think that's a very important policy issue, which complements all of the other ones that we have spoken about over this period.
Thank you very much. What I would like to do now is close the session, and I'd like to walk from Karen back here. Any final thought that you want to share with the audience that you have not had a chance to share? Any big gap, any major investment, any major action item that you want to put on the table?
I would simply come back, I think, to a comment that I made earlier, which is to say I think this is a very high-risk agenda. It's one that has potentially high returns, but it also has the risk that we continue to talk around the issues rather than talking to them in a very focused and specific way. And so I would hope that what we take away from this is a commitment to be very focused in our follow-up and to really address these issues of the definition of resilience, the conceptual framework, and how we can identify the really effective entry points so that we can actually make progress on the action agenda.
Thank you. Anita?
Thank you. I'd like to reiterate as well and slightly respond to Karen. Resilience can be thought of as being complex, or it can be thought of as being relatively simple, looking at it as ensuring that there's nutrition and food security in a sustainable manner for the future. So if we put it in that, it becomes relatively simple, and for that I would like to reiterate that we need commitments and investment now, today, so that we can work on these innovations as well as connecting the existing solutions that work to impact.
Thank you. Prabhu?
I want to come back to the point I was making about metrics and the three unique data sets that are now coming up, the LSMS, the vital signs work, and the harvest choice data. Now, it turns out that all of these three data efforts are all supported by one donor. And that's a very risky place to be. So one can question the resilience of the system to donor shocks. And so we need to figure out a way in which much of these data efforts can have a much more diversified portfolio of support, and especially get governments to step up. Developing country governments need to step up and support their own data work and their own data analysis.
Thank you. Dominique?
Well, in the previous session, resilience was described as a new model for the 21st century. Bridging was described as the 21st century way of working. So I think here with this agenda of resilience, we have a golden opportunity to bridge the gap between humanitarian work and development work. And we better do not miss this opportunity. And I think it's always important to bear in mind that both communities can benefit from this, both the humanitarian community and the development community, by injecting more, perhaps, pragmatism and responsiveness in the development community. I think can be really a win-win for both.
Thank you. Khalid?
Just a quick 2 points related to policy and how research affects policy, where Dearborn mentioned the importance of including smallholder farmers in the design of policy recommendations. But I would also argue that it's important to engage the policymakers themselves to make sure that there's clarity on what are you solving for. Because in some instances, you have researchers that are answering a question the policymakers aren't really looking for the answers for. And if that question is framed slightly differently, then the policymaker would be much more interested. So the framing of the question to ensure that it answers exactly the question that the policymaker is trying to answer, I think is vitally important. Otherwise, those policy recommendations end up sitting on the shelf as really nice ideas. The second, and somewhat relatedly, is to ensure that the research that's done to influence policies are looked at not in a vacuum by themselves, because most policies are not one-dimensional. When you're looking to affect the production of wheat, there are many different issues that increase in wheat production is going to have. So it's important to think about the domestic context of that policy recommendation for a particular country and a particular community, and answer those broader, as Prabhu mentioned, political economy questions, and not limited to the narrow scope of that research question that's being answered by the researcher. So I think a broader perspective on how policy-oriented research is done can ensure that it becomes much more applicable to policymakers and also for local communities.
Thank you. Sean?
Okay, I think from my perspective, the critical task ahead of us now is to really think about partnerships and who it is we need to work with, who needs to be at the table. A lot of talk about policy, a lot of talk about research. The question for me now is, how do we bring it to tangible action on the ground where we can demonstrate evidence and apply the thinking that's been done?
Thank you. Jay?
So I think the focus should be on creating financial independence for the farmers, the availability of good technology, and really getting a fair price in time for his output.
Thank you, Jay. Daiwan?
Thank you. I think we need to be, as stakeholders, investing more in farmer mobilization, because when farmers are working together in cohesive groups, you can better move them by assisting them to treat farming as business and not just be subsistence producers. And definitely when farmers are working together as cohesive groups, they'll be able to build resilience to achieve what we're trying to do here, food and nutrition security. Thank you.
Thank you. I will not dare to summarize. This was an extraordinarily rich panel over here, which is a very disciplined panel, a very comprehensive panel, and actually a very provocative panel too. I think we should go back and parse out and put the pieces together. All I would ask is that you join me in thanking them for a very rich set of interventions.